The Buddha never advised us to suppress our anger. He taught us to go back to ourselves and take good care of it. When we embrace our anger and take good care of our anger, we obtain relief. We can look deeply into it and gain many insights. One of the first insights may be that the seed of our anger in us has grown too big, and is the main cause of our misery. As we begin to see this reality, we realize that the other person, whom our anger is directed at, is only a secondary issue. The other person is not the real cause of our anger.
Reading from the 2nd chapter of John. Since it was almost the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and pigeons, while money changers sat at their counters. Making a whip out of cords, Jesus drove them all out of the temple, even the cattle and sheep, and overturned the tables of the money changers, scattering their coins. Then he faced the pigeon sellers. "Take all this out of here. Stop turning God's house into a market."
So nice of you to come this morning. I appreciate it.
So nice of you to come this morning.
Quick the standard K. Glennon disclaimer. Before I'm done here, some people are going to disagree with me, and some people are not going to like what I say. Please do not storm the lectern. I've done some work and some research on this, and it's been interesting. I told Diane a couple of months ago, I've been asked to give the sermon on January 15th, and she said, "What are you going to give it on?" And I said, anger. I'm going to give it on anger because I've gone to 1,000 church services, if I've gone to one, and no minister that I recall ever addressed the idea of anger. And she said, "Oh, good. That's good for you. You're an angry person." And I said, "What about you?" And we went on from there for a little while until I did something that I'm going to tell you about later, okay? All right. Isn't anger a spiritual issue? I mean, seriously. Isn't it something we all deal with? From what I've been reading, experts, more expert than me, yes, we all deal with anger. It's part of our makeup. Just as we have empathy and love, blah, 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 we have anger. We have anger too. There are problems with anger. It poisons the atmosphere of a workplace or a home or a church. When mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy. It can breed long-term resentment, grudges, and again, that can happen at home and at workplace. And it can lead to violence, physical and verbal. And the verbal violence that we dole out may be just as destructive as any physical violence. Because once those angry words come out of your mouth, or maybe the angry words that came out of your dad's mouth, or the angry words that where those words are gone. They're like wild horses. They're out of sight in a minute, and they're off to plant themselves in somebody's psyche for a lifetime, maybe. Often those angry words do not get forgotten. Anger makes people unhappy. It is the spread of unhappiness. It's kind of like a match thrown into a bunch of other matches. It just can build quickly, very quickly. I think part of the reason why it's so hard to address anger in a church gathering is there's so many reactions to it. There's different reactions from different people. Some people are passive. Some people say, well, I haven't been angry since I was 6 years old. From all that I've encountered, though, as reading and research, it's something we deal with all the time. Then there's the passive-aggressive approach. And here you find the person who has sort of a cynical view of things and who delivers snide comments and somehow puts you over there and me over here. Us, them, me, you. We're separate. I'm over here kind of laughing at you. Then you have the aggressive approach, where, people freely blow their top or express anger. It's an aggressive emotion. M. Scott Peck, the author of The Road Less Traveled, wrote a book called A Different Drum, and he addressed anger in that book. And he said, anytime there's a community, anytime people are together in a community, there's going to be anger. And he attributed this to violation of territory and property, both spiritual and material, both spiritual and material. Material is easy enough to figure out, Mom, Tommy's playing with my airplane. He's angry. Robert, I think our neighbor is planting a garden and it's overlapping our property line. The psychological part of it, or the spiritual part of it, often takes the form of marginalization. You're marginalizing a group or person. We find this in anti-Semitism, for instance. We discount all Jews. We do not respect what they say. We do not respect what they do. Racism, we discount black people. We marginalize them. We push them over to the edge over there, and we don't take them seriously because they're not as superior as we are. This happens in families too. Probably in more subtle tone. Little Johnny might have spilled the pie on the kitchen floor when he was 13 years old. And ever since then, he's been known as the family klutz. 30 years later, he's 43 years old with a successful dental practice and 3 lovely children. But he's still the family klutz when they get together. And this kind of marginalization does bring anger. Martin Luther King, thank you, Connie Hopeveld, for that example. You better believe it. Where did all that start, Women's suffrage. In 1920, women were given the right to vote in the United States of America. 100 years ago. What? You mean the wisest person I ever encountered in my life was my granddaughter on my mother's side, and she couldn't vote until she was 49 years old. It's crazy. Again, anger is, when we experience anger, even from a distance, it's always us, strong, versus them. And it's not as if we don't see anger in the Bible. The reading today talks about Jesus and the money changers. And it brings up a word I want to use called righteousness. His anger was righteous. When we are angry, we are right. We are correct. Our point of view is absolutely right. But we can be wrong. And we should keep that in mind. We can be wrong. When Jesus was kicking over those stands, whatever, scattering the animals everywhere. Maybe behind those animals were some people who were trying to make this week's rent. Maybe the temple was dependent on the income from the money changers and the sacrifice sellers. I mean, there actually is two sides to every argument, every expression of anger. And can you think of a time when you were really strongly angry, righteous about something that kind of turned out to be maybe not exactly right? Anger does have its place. It definitely has its place. As an advocate for the arts, I would say that some of the great art that has been produced has come from moral outrage. A specific example, and this applies to theater, literature, art, the visual art, music. An example I'd like to give would be Bob Dylan, who was given the Nobel Prize for literature, or for poetry a few years ago. The Nobel Prize for poetry. Pretty serious. But basically, he was a musician, as we know him. And his seminal genius albums were created in the 60s, and the subject matter was often anger at being marginalized and being abused. So art has its, anger does have its place. Also, we can reset boundaries. We can reset boundaries for the good of all. Women's suffrage certainly falls into that category. As I was telling Diane, I don't think the prayer circles created the women's right to vote. I think a little bit of anger that turned into advocacy, that hit the streets. That's what brought women to vote. It was, they had to meet, they had to be aggressive. They had to go out there. Many of the suffragettes spent time in prison. It works at the home, in the home. Darling, as I recall, when we did our wedding vows, I didn't sign up to be a stellar roommate for you while you watched the football games. I am a little angry about it. And I would like you to help me after each meal. Put the dishes away and start the dishwasher. And your sensitive husband, of course, will comply. But things like that, sometimes you have to. When I was teaching, I taught for 34 years, and teaching was an important piece of my toolbox. Every semester, I'd get 4 or 5 new classes, 30 kids in class, 30, 35. They'd walk into my art classroom, which is all full of materials that can easily be abused. And I have to own that room. And I would say for the first 6 weeks of every semester, I'd put on my Mr. Grouchy routine, What are you doing? What are you doing? Well, anger, as it turns out, was the language that everybody understood. I could politely say, please clean the brushes, children. But it was more like, hey, what have I got here in my hand? I got a bunch of dirty brushes. This is my territory here, and people are going to use these after you. Clean your brushes. And every once in a while, I'd have to have like a little individual conference. Again, marking my territory. But the anger that I'm talking about, and that that I'm talking about, is the anger that spreads in the workplace, in the family, and it makes people unhappy, puts people on edge. When mama ain't happy, again, ain't nobody happy. That anger, and this is what I found out, the anger doesn't go away. It's a matter of you dealing with your anger. And how can we deal with it? These aren't the same methods that Diane was using with kids, but with kids. Number one, there's three of them. Number one, we really have to consciously become less righteous. We have to understand that there's two sides to an argument, and things can be wrong. Things can be just wrong. This is sometimes difficult to do. But it is also a compassionate thing to do. The second thing is, and this may not make a whole lot of sense, but we have to be aware. We just have to be aware when we get angry. We have to know when it is, when it's coming. My daughter in North Carolina describes this as listening to the shark music. You know, da 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 da. Here comes the fin. I am swimming out here. When that anger is coming at you, it's good to know it. It's good to just be aware of it. It's called mindfulness. Be aware of that anger and take it from there. Get a couple of soft words. Well, how far do you want this anger to escalate? Do you really need to try to change somebody's mind whose mind isn't going to change anyway? And the last quote that I'm going to give you is something that is, again, from Thich Nhat Hanh, who is a Buddhist, Vietnamese Buddhist teacher who died recently, highly respected. When the mother embraces her baby, her energy penetrates him and soothes him. This is exactly what you have to do when anger begins to surface. You have to abandon everything that you are doing because your most important task is to go back to yourself and take care of your baby, your anger. Nothing is more urgent than taking care of your baby. And I think most of us can kind of identify with that. The baby's crying, it's unhappy. Well, that's part of you. You know, you are the one who is angry. You are the one who is unhappy. In the first quote, this teacher says, you really have to think of yourself as that anger belongs to you, and it's not, the other person is not the cause. When we are angry, we suffer. We all wish to be happy. We all wish to be in harmony with other people. When we are angry, the people around us suffer and become angry. When we are happy, we spread our happiness around us. The people around us become happy. Your anger is your anger. And I believe it is your spiritual issue here as we walk on our sacred journeys.
Thank you.